Won Young Lim is the chair of the next session, and Amar Bhattacharya from Brookings Institute is going to be one of the lead speakers of the panel. And we have Manuel Montes from Southcenter. We have Rahel Kasahun from SIDOA. And we have Barry Karen from CG. And Mina Toksöz from Chatham House.
Hi, I'm Won Hyuk Lim from Korea Development Institute. I'm chairing this session. If you could grab your coffee and sit down, we'll start. Actually, we'll start anyway. We are about an hour and 30 minutes behind schedule. So as she just mentioned, we'll try to keep the time limit very strictly. As far as the development agenda for the G20 is concerned, there are basically three major items. One is the core agenda from the G20 Seoul Development Consensus from 2010, with infrastructure being the first pillar and knowledge sharing being the ninth and last pillar. And the Mexican presidency in 2012 added green growth to that development consensus. The second item, as some mentioned in the previous session, has to do with the post-2015 development agenda. So what would succeed Millennium Development Goals, MDGs, after 2015? And as was mentioned, Sustainable Development Goals are supposed to succeed these MDGs. And the key notion there is sustainability in its economic, social, and environmental dimensions. And even though one may argue that countries like China, Korea, and others didn't develop on the basis of MDGs, it's at the same time important to get the goals and targets right for the successor to the MDGs. Because MDGs and its successor represent the highest level agreement on global development cooperation and serves as reference point for national development planning as well as development cooperation. So it's important to get critical items that sustain development into the sustainable development goals. For instance, under the MDGs, you could support projects that benefit or have a positive contribution to sanitation, but you could not support, if you're a development cooperation agency, say transportation infrastructure. You would have a much more difficult time justifying and rationalizing projects on transportation networks, part of the reason being that MDGs serve as an effective reference point for budget planning and so on. And finally, the third item for the G20 development agenda, as some mentioned, is financing for development, and it's directly related to the eighth MDG, the MDG 8, Global Partnership for Development. And since the Lester Pearson report of 1969, this 0.7% of GNI for ODA goal has been there and has not been met, and has been a bone of contention for development cooperation on a global level. So it's all nice and good to have a successor to the MDGs in terms of sustainable development goals, but at the end of the day, how do we ensure their implementation, and what kinds of money are we talking about when we get to development financing? So those, I think, are the three key items for G20 development agenda at the current moment. And we have a very distinguished panel for this session. And since all the panel members have been already introduced, I'll skip the introduction and just ask each of the panelists to give their comments in 7 minutes or less. So first, Amar, could you go?
Thank you, Wanyuk, and I will go straight to my intervention. So I want to build exactly on where you left off, Wanyuk, which is this is a milestone year in development because we have 3 key events that will in some sense shape not just the aspirations of the world, but the means by which we will achieve those aspirations. My colleagues and I circulated a note which said why the G20 should be very involved in that agenda. I'm going to answer the second half of the question that is not in that paper, which is what the G20 should be doing. And I want to begin by recalling a little bit of history, since I happen to, be privileged to watch it, and that is that Monterey would not have succeeded without the G20. The discussions on Monterey got their traction in the G20 finance ministers process, and the G20 brought the G7 along. So I think it's extremely important that this time round too, the G20 be prepared to drive and to engage in the agenda, especially in the Addis event. Why the Addis event? Because the social development goals, with its 17 goals and 164 targets, may, in the views of some, be considered too many. It will be the result of a highly political process. There will be a lot of disagreements. And in the end, one will question whether all of them can be achieved and whether they can all be achieved universally. Nevertheless, what is important is to agree on what concrete actions will be taken in order to achieve a realistic outcome as a means of the collective actions of the world. And where will that be done? It will be done in Addis, because Addis will focus on the means of implementation. And why is Addis so important? Because it will also connect the larger financing for development issues with the climate finance issue, which will come in Paris. And so it's extremely important not just to engage as individual stakeholders, but for the G20 to also form some views about the issues. So what are the big issues that are going to be there on the table at Addis? The first is, if we are going to achieve the higher ambitions, both with regard to poverty reduction, with regard to the social development goals, and with regard to integration of environment, social, and economic, you have to have as the fundamental pillar domestic resource mobilization. And this is both in the advanced countries, but it's also in the poorer countries and in a more difficult environment. So in that context, there are lots of very important proposals on the table which are being discussed, and it's important that the work of the G20 feed that process. Second, on domestic resource mobilization, the G20 is leading on international tax cooperation, which means avoidance of harmful tax competition and avoidance of tackling tax avoidance through the base erosion profit shifting initiative, tax information exchange, and the like. So the G20 absolutely has to engage in using the UN for the larger agenda that it is pushing within the G20 itself. The second, and I won't mention very much about it, is infrastructure. Infrastructure and investment is a central issue here in the G20, and that conversation needs to be connected with what will be discussed in Addis. And this is a two-way street. I think there are lots of good ideas being discussed in New York that the G20 needs to take on board, and the work plan of the G20 is absolutely relevant to what will be discussed in Addis. Third, financial inclusion and SME has been mentioned a lot here. There are work streams in the G20, and this is a very important aspect of, I would say, inclusive finance that has to be tackled in Addis. Again, the G20 has a big contribution to make. Fourth, and I think it's very important to highlight this, is the agenda of the Istanbul Program of Action for the Least Developed Countries. This was hatched here in this city, and it has greatly unified the least developed countries around a program of action and around a program of partnership. The G20 can give that traction because a lot of those commitments need to be reaffirmed and need to be delivered on. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, but I think linking the Istanbul program of action to the G20 is entirely appropriate given that Turkey is in the presidency of the G20. We talked about the multilateral development banks, and indeed if you look at the Secretary General's report and you look at the discussions in the UN, there is a proposal to create an Mdb Commission. And I think that's not a bad idea. Why? Because the architecture of MDBs has changed very significantly, and we need to have some common principles, but also contestability. It's good that the old institutions are being challenged by the new, but what is it that we want out of the system as a whole? And how do we tackle the issues of governance that were mentioned? So I think we will not get all the answers by the time of Addis, but having an Mdb Commission would be actually a very productive outcome coming out of this meeting and addressing some of what I would call the fundamental differences in the dialogue within the G20. It's not that there is complete coherence of views within the G20 on this issue. The next item that will be very important is the famous official development assistance commitments, and how does it relate to climate finance? How do you connect Addis to ultimately to Paris? How do you view the measurement? What do we mean by additionality? My personal view is what's important is the adequacy of financing from all sources, not some measurement issue, one block or the other. But in order to understand that, one needs a very clear analytical framework to understand where the requirements are, what the contributions of the different pools of finance are, and how you can make it a whole. And that conversation requires, in some sense, some homework to be done by the G20, not just by the UN. Finally, there is the big topic of systemic issues. And the G20, not surprisingly, is central to that discussion, not the UN. I often say in the UN that you can accept something, not everything has to be invented in New York. You know, there are very good ideas that you can take from elsewhere, but the UN has the comparative advantage in making it universal and in integrating that agenda. So what are the big systemic issues where the G20 is leading and where it does not need to be repeated in New York? First and foremost, the financial regulatory agenda. There are incompletes on the financial regulatory agenda, as Malcolm Knight pointed out, but the lead on the financial regulatory agenda comes squarely from the G20. The rest of the countries that are involved are price takers. They have very, very little influence. But it is important for the G20 to be able to explain and to legitimize that agenda in a universal forum. The second issue that has been mentioned is debt restructuring. There are different views out there, but there can be no doubt that we have a problem, that the system right now is incomplete, and addressing that is a crying need. We can address it within the IMF, we can address it through the discussions on the statutory framework, we can address it through the proposals of a sovereign debt forum that CG has been pushing, but we need to have a discussion of it. We can't say this is off the table. So I think it's important to connect the discussion of the to have the G20 play a role in this and to ensure that that issue gets tackled. A fourth issue which Monterey put on the table and was a very important driving force was IFI reform. And yes, we have had reforms in the IMF and the World Bank. It's not that there have been no reforms, but the reforms are fairly modest and incomplete. So how we move forward on that agenda requires not just the support of the G20, it requires the support of the world at large. And I think putting it squarely on the Addis agenda as something that the world still aspires to is, I think, very important to do. I won't talk about trade and I won't talk about technology transfer. My view is the UN should push for this agenda, but as the discussion showed, even the G20 on these two issues, trade and technology transfer, rather peripherally involved. And so the question arises now is, if we're going to push on this as a central part of implementation, where are we going to push? What do we mean by the technology transfer agenda at this point in time? Not only intellectual property rights, but some of the commitments that had been made, and what would be the forum. So I don't think this will be necessarily decided, but it is important for in the G20 to say, we think that this is how, if the G20 is to be a steering committee, it has to be able to say, we think this is where we are going to move this agenda and how the whole thing will come together. Finally, Makuzan, I don't see him, has been pushing since the Paris leadership on international monetary system reform. I don't think this is an area, again, that we are going to make a breakthrough, but it is important to ask ourselves, so what are the aspirations that we have with regard to international monetary system reform? I mean, it's very clear that we need to have better liquidity management. It's very clear that we need to think about the reserve currency issue. It's very clear that we need better financial safety nets. So which of these issues do we think ought to be pushed? The important thing is to have a conversation that connects the G20 with the UN and pushes this in a way that is constructive. My sense from participating in both conversations is the two conversations are really quite separate. And that is not good for the world, and that's not good for either group. So thank you very much.
Okay, I'd like to ask panelists to stay on the development agenda. There was a very good presentation on the relationship between the G20 and UN, but I would once again like to ask the panelists to stay on the development agenda. Next speaker is Manuel Montes from Southcenter.
Thank you, Chair. I come from the Southcenter, which is a think tank of developing countries. We always say that we are functionally equivalent to the OECD, except that we're much smaller because our funding comes to the developing countries and their funding is not very stable. Right? And in this discussion, I want to talk in terms of the G20 situation, that the G20 it's not about development, it's about developing countries. Right? There's a difference, right? Just like there's a difference between the private sector and private firms, right? So, and here, my discussion will really talk about the interests of developing countries. I'll try to read directly so that I don't stray. 2015, which is the year of Turkey's presidency of the G20, is a very difficult year, and the burden is going to be very difficult. There are three events that has been pointed out, right? And in December, in the Climate Change Summit, the community of nations will seek to agree on allocations of emissions rights among the countries that are part of the community. If in the next 20 years, the emission reduction obligations fall too heavily on the developing countries, and if the elasticity of growth in emissions with respect to economic activity changes too slowly, the last time I computed this elasticity was 0.74, right? 1% growth in GDP, 0.74 increase in emissions. Then developing countries, even the more advanced developing countries, I'm talking, let's say, about China, it's a member of the G20, will be condemned to a permanently lower level of per capita income, which is about 1/3 to 1/4 of the per capita income of developed countries right now. In September, a new UN development agenda will be agreed. This will replace the MDGs, as has been said, and the Washington Consensus Axis, which had served as the basis for development cooperation since the turn of the millennium. In July, the third Financing for Development Conference will occur in Addis Ababa to agree upon the financing inputs to the renewed development agenda, and it's theoretically an input to the September discussions on the new development agenda. When the third Financing for Development Conference takes place in Addis Ababa, the global economy will still be struggling to overcome the adverse effects of the near collapse of the 2007-2008 international financial system crisis. Unlike previous crises, the ongoing crisis originated in the developed countries. For the developing countries, again, you know, there's development, there's developing countries. Right? The first reality the conference must address is that developing countries are net financial investors in developed country financial sectors. The international system is not mobilizing financing for development on a net basis in favor of developing countries. Central banks in developing countries have been building up their international reserves as a form of self-insurance from any sudden reversal of private investment flows as had devastated the East Asian economies in the late 1990s. So the age of open capital accounts, instead of allowing countries to reduce the level of their reserves, have compelled a 2- to 3-fold increase in the level of these reserves. We live in a world of much greater financial integration, much greater volumes of international financial flows, and greater vulnerability on the part of developing countries. Emerging and developing countries are vulnerable to the scenarios of development reversals that are sparked by external financing crises. In fact, in April-May 2013, there was a taper tantrum. And recently, Malaysia itself, which is not a member of the G20, has had early signs of financial difficulties. The previous high period of global liquidity, low interest rates, and high commodity prices saw increased international liabilities on the part of developing countries, including the so-called frontier economies that never floated international bonds before, talking about Côte d'Ivoire, countries in Africa. With the prospect of normalization of with U.S. monetary policy, developing and emerging countries face a period of reversals in the direction of private capital flows, rising interest rates, and depressed commodity prices. With open capital accounts, many developing countries are now able to borrow significant amounts from non-residents in their own currencies. A reversal of these flows will induce domestic financing difficulties, domestic private bankruptcies, and foreign exchange difficulties. For example, between 2010 and 2013, non-resident holdings of government debt securities of Turkey increased from 21 to 36.5% of GDP. Actually, many of our chief economist happens to be Turkish, and his name is Yilmaz Akgüz, and the calculations of this number come from this paper, which is on our website. Right? For Mexico, Mexico is a member also of the G20, it increased from 33% to 53%, and for South Africa, it increased from 20% to 32%. So there's a very big exposure now in domestic currency, right? Moreover, as has been highlighted by the IMF, resident private corporations in developing countries have been borrowing in foreign currency during the liquidity boom. And the numbers I gave you last time were just between 2010 and 2013. So this buildup happened in the last 3 years. 1 minute. And there are numbers I have for Turkey, which is really bad, right? Let me give the number for Turkey. Between 2010 and 2013, Turkey's private international debt, not the sovereign debt, right, increased from 14.1 to 20.6% of GDP. Indonesia, 7.9 to 12.1%. The international economy now does not have many of the public tools to monitor and control volatile private capital movements. It also lacks an orderly and commonly recognized approach to dealing with liquidity crisis of sovereigns and cross-border solvency crisis of private companies. So there is a need to restore, expand, and reinforce policy space, especially in the capital account management, to manage volatile private capital swings and check contagion. And there is an uncompleted financial regulation process that Amar said. Let me just give my last 2 more paragraphs, if you don't mind. Right? The Open Working Group in the UN have agreed on 17 goals, 169 associated goals, and 62 means of implementation and global partnership for development. These are very ambitious goals. Not all of them will be achieved. I'm very supportive of what Amar said about finding some very specific thing. But let me give the first two specific things that perhaps, and I don't have very specific language to propose, that the G20 should consider. One is a reversal of the current situation in which developing countries are net financial investors in developed countries. Number 2, attention and mitigation to the worsening proximate situation of financing for development, especially because of the lack of an orderly debt resolution mechanism. Thank you very much.
Rahel Kasahun of CDOA.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rahel Kasahun. So, picking up on what has been said so far, actually, let me go back a little further. And I've been thinking about, well, we've had a number of discussions. The relevance of the G20 has been discussed a few times this morning and also this afternoon. Of course, to the member countries, it is very important. But how important is the G20 to the rest of the world? And in particular, because I come from Africa, I've been thinking about how relevant is the G20 to African countries. As it stands, it's not, Africa does not have a very strong relationship with the G20. And we would like to change that. I think it should change, mainly because, well, there are a number of reasons. One, the world cannot afford to dismiss or marginalize Africa any longer. African countries are growing at a robust rate. There are a number of countries that have been growing at double digits for a number of years. That includes Ethiopia, Ghana, Rwanda, and many of these economies are transforming and growing. And many of them are not driven by, the growth is not driven by minerals or oil. It's real development that's happening on the ground. So a growing and a prosperous Africa is good for Africa, and it's very good for the world. It's good for, particularly now when global growth is very sluggish and there is a lot of effort in trying to figure out what to do about that. The world should be looking at many of the developing world, the developing countries, and mainly because there is a rapidly growing middle class, and there's a huge unmet demand for a number of products and services. So there's a very good reason to look at and develop a strong and a deeper relationship with Africa. Of course, you know, South Africa is a member country, but normally South Africa is there, not representing the entire continent. A number of organizations, the international organization institutions such as the African Union, the African Development Bank, they both are founding institutions, CODA, and NEPAD has observer status at the G20 meetings, but they usually are invited to the Leaders Summit, and there's no engagement or there's no real engagement in the preparatory process, and that hurts or limits actually the Africa's role in the G20. But I think there is some opening, there is progress, because and you know the engagement can be deepened by looking at areas, global issues that are of interest both to African countries and other developing countries, as well as the G20 countries. Last year, in 2014, the G20 endorsed the Global Common Reporting Standard for Automatic Exchange of Tax Information. That's basically to prevent cross-border tax evasion, and this is a part of the OECD and G20 initiative known as the base erosion and profit shifting. This is of particular interest to Africa now because, as has been said, domestic resource mobilization is an important issue. There's a lot of focus now, particularly with the summit, the Development for Financing Summit approaching very fast. Many countries are now looking for how do we mobilize domestic resource to finance development. And a study was recently, just actually 2 weeks ago, was released by the UN Economic Commission for Africa. And basically the study showed that an estimated, and this is a very conservative estimate, 50 to 60 billions of dollars are flowing out of the continent illegally, or not illegally actually, through illicit financial flows. They're not necessarily illegal, because a lot of it is mainly it's the multinational companies who are using various loopholes, tax evasion, transfer pricing, and a number of different other mechanisms in order to illicitly transfer financial revenues out of the countries where they generate, where it's generated. So there's a huge resource there. If something can be done about it, it can be channeled towards development efforts. So this is a very big topic now on the continent. We're thinking about what to do about it, how to go about it, how do we approach it, and who to partner with. And the G20 can be a great partner because they've already started the work. They, as I said, in 2014, they endorsed this initiative. And so there are a number of areas in which we can collaborate. So now the question is what kind of follow through, what we need to follow up and see how do we actually start implementation, how do we share information, knowledge, and also what are the specific ways, technical assistance, or so we have to figure out how do we actually make this work for both countries or all countries involved. By the way, illicit financial flows is not just a problem. It's not just an African problem. It's actually the biggest source is Asia. Asian countries are losing a huge amount of money every year. And so if this problem, even if it's just, we just focus on this one global issue, it can be, the partnership can be very, very beneficial to everyone involved. And in the process, the G20's relevance will be much more relevant to African countries as well as the rest of the world. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. She talked about the role of the G20 in financial integrity issues, the BEPS and so on. Our next speaker is Barry Karen from CG in Canada. So without further ado.
Well, I often say that in the G20 all countries are equal, but some are more equal than others. And on the G20 agenda, all agenda items are equal, but some agenda items are more equal than others. And we have a problem on the development side because it's not the most influential or the most serious issue that confront leaders. So it's incumbent on us to come up with some very cogent, compelling rationales for attention. Otherwise, officials are just not going to give us the attention that we want. One anecdote in terms of reminding people here who aren't very familiar with governmental processes is there are limits of command. I'll give you an example from the 2002 G7 summit in Kananaskis, Alberta. The Canadian government made a big deal of Africa. Africa was on the agenda. 5 African presidents were invited to the summit. In the final family photo, the 5 African presidents were there for the press conference. They spoke at the press conference. And after the meeting, our Sherpa wrote to various ambassadors of international organizations, our permanent representatives there, and wrote to our executive director at the IMF. You know, we basically control one of the constituencies, one of the board seats, and told our executive director of the IMF, here's what we decided in terms of initiatives for Africa, and here's what we want you to do. And the executive director, appointed by the Canadian Minister of Finance, wrote back saying, thank you very much for your letter. We really appreciate views from the public. So the point is that we have a difficult task. When I was first given this agenda, there were three questions on it. Basically, one of the questions was, what's needed to develop an effective development agenda? And I want to deal with that question rather than the other ones. And was posed, do we need new ideas? And I don't think there are any new ideas. I think, as a matter of fact, in looking for the next declaration, if you go back at the last 13 or 14 international declarations going to 19, going back to the United Nations Declaration on the Right to Development, you'd be hard-pressed to find any vocabulary that hasn't been used once or twice already. It's a question of rearranging the words. There are no new ideas. Do we need more money? Read Angus Deaton's book. No, we don't need more money. You know, we need better governance. We have poor governance. We need better institutions, and we need, instead of toxic policies, we need some decent policies, but we don't need more money. Do we need more effective implementation? Probably. But the question is, the other question was, do we need new institutions? And I think, yes, we do. We need to change the mandate of some of our existing institutions, maybe resource some of them better, and we're going to need some new institutions. If you ask yourself, what will the international organization chart look like in 2025, I think it's going to be very different from today's, just as today's is very different from the organization 10 years ago. Matt mentioned this morning that what the G20 can do is it does problem solving, agenda setting, and create habits of cooperation. I think it does one other thing. It's the only mechanism we have to determine whether or not existing international institutions are fit for purpose and can they be improved. International organizations do not reform themselves. So the impetus has to come from, I believe, the G20 if we're going to get any innovations. We have to think, though, of the filters to get on the G20 agenda, to come up with a credible proposal that the presidency and the Troika will think is actually feasible to pursue. And if the main objective, Center for Global Development says, well, the purpose of development is it has several objectives. Help stabilize fragile states. I don't think that's a G20 function. Make growth more inclusive. I beg to differ. I don't think that's what it's about. Address cross-border problems that affect everybody. Yes, that's what it's about. Matt also mentioned this morning that we got to come up with concrete small steps to be realistic. So let me give you a couple of concrete small steps. The average, psychologists tell us the average audience can deal with at most three points. But this is not an average audience, so I'm going to give you 8 suggestions. First, I think we should do some research on how to finesse the U.S. Congress. You know, Amar mentioned the problem with the U.S. Congress. Mr. President Obama is on record of he's going to finesse the Congress on a whole series of domestic issues. Maybe there are ways to do something with respect to institutional reform at the IMF, and in the paper, in the package that you all should have in terms of access to the Dropbox or at least zip files, Andres Rosenthal and I came up with one suggestion on how to actually finesse it. So that's one. Second, I think if you go to Richard Manning's presentation, his paper, he had 6 or 7 ideas. One of them is to just come up with a standardized formula for public-private partnership agreements. I think that's a small step. It's a simple thing to do, and it'll be very helpful. And I commend you to read Manning's paper. Third, Rahel's paper is worth reading, too, in terms of illicit financial transfers. There's a problem there that the G20 has. Financial intelligence units don't exist in all countries, And the informal organization that groups them, it's called the Egmont Group of Financial Intelligence Units. China has refused to join because Taiwan is a member. That has to be fixed. How can we have an international organization without China in it? It's got to be fixed, and so that's something that G20 officials can. It's scalable, I think. Mention's been made of the international conferences to come. They're all going to be, well, I'd like to find a diplomatic euphemism, but they're going to fail. There's not going to be more money coming at Addis. When you look at the various burden-sharing agreements, you know, the U.S. has to pay between 20, 25, 30%, depending on who's in the population. If the poor countries are not in, the U.S. shares 30%. It's just not going to be forthcoming. You know, we have to stop kidding ourselves about all these aspirational sums of money that are supposed to appear. The Green Climate Fund, really, I'm confused about that. I think we have to have a pipeline of approved projects before we ask for the money. We do things backwards. Every legislature, before it approves a budget, has a spending plan, has an expenditure plan. Well, we put the cart before the horse in trying to get climate finance. It doesn't make sense. What we have to do is get a large set of pre-approved projects, and then let's go out and look for the money, rather than just asking countries to pledge. So Mike Callahan and I have written the paper to that effect that's in the package that TPAV will have. I think post-2015 is going to have to be rescued. If the UN comes out in September with aspirational goals, 17 aspirational goals, it's going to have absolutely no concrete impact in the world. That is not a new paradigm saying that everything is a priority. As Wan Hyuk and I are fond of saying, if everything's a priority, then nothing's a priority. Now, the G20 can't fix that. It's too late. So what the G20 should do is say, what a terrific job you guys have done in September, and what we in the G20 are going to do is we're going to concentrate on 2 or 3 of these goals. And we're going to measure our success by picking 4 or 5 targets, maximum. And you do something that's focused and concrete and represented as being in support of this hopeless UN decision, rather than criticize a decision. You can be positive. If we were looking for a longer-term project for the T20, I think one of the questions we could ask ourselves is, if we were starting from scratch, what kind of coordination mechanisms would we have to sort of coordinate the efforts of all the various international organizations and silos? What we have today is the UN Chief Executives Board, which meets twice a year and has a small secretariat. Is that satisfactory? If we were starting with a clean slate, what kind of machinery, what kind of organizational structures would we put into place? And then I think two last points. I said there's no new ideas, but a lot could be done about promoting and publicizing excellent ideas and best practices in the past. And the G20 could commission a group of organizations to compile examples of terrific successes, you know, advanced market commitments, conditional cash grants. There's a whole series of innovative techniques that have been used, and we should be publicizing those. And then last but not least, the G20 process itself. I was very sorry to see our friends in Mexico split the preparatory process into 2 tracks. It was a grievous error. The grievous error was repeated by subsequent hosts in Russia and Australia, and unfortunately, our Turkish friends never took our advice and they maintained these 2 tracks. We can't fix that. Maybe China can fix it. There's got to be 1 track. The idea of relegating the development issue over to the Sherpa process when the questions really have to do with financing doesn't make any sense. But we can't fix that, but there's 2 things we could do. First, Turkey should ask a couple of countries, especially low-income countries, to second a couple of officials for 2 or 3 months to the development working group and come up with some prospects and have them included in the preparatory process. And finally, I think if you had a finance development ministers meeting, that would bring some attention and provide some motivation for the system to generate some real products. So I know there's going to be a labor ministers or an employment ministers meeting with the finance ministers. It also would be nice to have one with finance development ministers meeting. So thank you for your attention. I appreciate it.
Our last speaker is Nina Toxos.
Well, that was a difficult, after that very competent presentation with so much experience in international organizations, it's a bit difficult one to follow on. But actually, I'm coming from a very different place. I'm coming from, as a practitioner, looking at development issues and international financial flows, having worked in international finance. In particular, I worked for the last decade in a bank that was very much focused on emerging markets, in particular Africa. And the sort of I'm now going to reveal how ancient I am. I actually studied here in this library, but also I've watched 3 rounds of capital flows and crises, third world development crises. So there was the 70s, which led to the 1980s third world crisis. There was the 90s, and which led to Mexico, Asian crisis and the Russian default. And then there was, of course, the last decade, which ended with the 2008 crisis. And just to pick up from the Korean colleague from Kiev in the previous session, who was advised that 2010 was a crisis, might be a crisis year. And I'm thinking about 2015, and I'm going to stick my neck out and say that I think 2015 is not going to be a crisis year. I think it's going to be a muddle-through year, which, you know, gives an opportunity for an organization like the G20 to get its act together. However, let's not get too comfortable about it, because financial crises come every 10 years, and therefore the next one should come sometime after 2016. And you know, looking at the glut of financial liquidity, the unsustainable rise of financial markets, the kind of, you know, the quantitative easing that has brought a very uneven growth pattern in the US, where it's very consumer-driven, debt-driven. Same with the UK, it's very evident, while other bits of the world are slowing or stagnating. So I do think that you know, people have been asking, what is the role of the G20, etc. Well, G20 has proven it's quite good at crisis management, and I think we should just, you know, stick to that, actually, because there's another one coming. And so how ready is the world economy for the next crisis is the question that I'm sort of keep thinking about, which is most likely to be associated with the tightening of and the normalization of monetary policies, which will begin sometime this year. Now, you know, and also how useful will G20 be in managing this volatility that is about to hit the global economy? And I think there's been a number of, you know, I think there's not enough beating our own drum in terms of the G20, because certain things have been done that were proposed at the 2010 Korean summit. One of them was that, you know, there should be more crisis prevention, pre-arrangements to deal with capital flow volatility and so on, rather than waiting for it and then bailing out countries. So there's been many proposals made to beef up liquidity facilities by the IMF, which has been done. Regional swap arrangements in Asia have been beefed up. bailout fund in the Eurozone is now, sitting there quite large. So the number of things have been done. And then policy buffers, the IMF and other organizations have been talking about all these things, preparing countries that are at the receiving end of capital flows and capital volatility to be able to absorb these shocks when they come. So some of these things are, we all know, flexible exchange rates and so on. I won't go on about it. Basel III, has come up with sort of counter-cyclical measures to ensure micro-prudential rules about leverage ratios and so on. So, but this is all well and good, but these are all defensive measures. Yeah, they're not. They're sort of assume, that there can't really be anything that can be done, and let's just sort of try to defend and create some buffers. And I'm suggesting that really we can do better than that and think a bit further. And but interest in this kind of macroeconomic coordination to try to crisis prevention, etc., has really receded, and it has receded in the agenda of the G20 as the crisis, memories of the crisis has somehow faded a bit. And basically policymakers in the bigger economies have gone back to the policy of, well, what's good for us is good for the world economy, ignoring the spillovers and also not to mention the spillbacks of certain policies such as quantitative easing. And also, the IMF has come up with some really good studies recently where they show about 30% of the spillovers of policies from the major developed advanced economies spills back into these economies. So, it's not like you can just sort of ignore all these shocks to the global economy. And so really, and also not only that, but financial integration is growing, it's going to grow even more. Developing countries, emerging markets are going to become bigger receivers of capital flows. Currently, they receive about 20% of global total inflows. Well, in 2030, this is expected to rise to 50% by some studies. So, that the integration of the global economy is only going to increase. So there's no way of getting around thinking about more macroeconomic policy coordination and more counter-cyclical policies to cut the pro-cyclicality of capital flows. And the other reason why this has sort of fallen out of the agenda, there wasn't very much in the Brisbane summit on this, was that the countries have fallen out of the habit of cooperation, and really the 2008 cooperation, 8-9 cooperation was a sort of an exception to the rule. So what do we need? And I'll just say my couple of proposals. Well, the IFIs, international financial organizations, should continue, and the G20 material should continue to focus on the need for counter-cyclical fiscal policy. And I think the pressure on Germany, someone was mentioning the Eurozone, imbalances in the Eurozone. Pressure on Germany should be maintained to loosen up its fiscal stance. Secondly, monetary policy goals should be broadened from just narrow inflation targeting to include financial stability. And that is something that, has only just started to be talked about and hasn't really started to happen. I think that there should be greater use of macroprudential policy. I think that T20 could actually do more work on macroprudential policies. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, after the 30s, depression, World War II, it was Keynesian demand management that kind of kept the world economy, world growth going for several years. It has its limits, but it has its uses too. And I think today we're at the stage where macroprudential policy is the new Keynesian demand, I mean, it's private demand management. It is that important. Those measures can be that effective if used properly. And I think in Turkey, it was a really good example of how credit growth was really going far too fast back in 2012, I think it was, and current account deficit had ballooned, and it was the banking regulator that basically came down and said credit growth, cut it to no more than 15% nominal. And banks just had to go along with that. And so I think there is more that can be done, and developing countries use these things a lot more than advanced economies, and this could be looked at a lot more. And so I'm just going to end by saying that the G20 is this fantastic forum, especially for a country like Turkey, where it's kind of hasn't been able to fit in that well with, the Atlantic-centered IMF, G7, and World Bank, and it's sort of there's been problems with its attempts to get closer to the Middle East, because the Middle East is now in crisis, and it's very different to the old former Soviet. So it's kind of stuck on it, so it hasn't been able to become a member of the EU. And the G20 is really a perfect place for a country like Turkey, but others as well, like sort of middle-income, which can be defined as middle-income economies, which have a tremendous interest in international cooperation. And I think more should be made of sort of middle-income countries coming together. It should be more conscious. I'm not suggesting some kind of a new middle-income BRIC formation or anything, but there's more that can be made there, because it's very much in their interest to have international cooperation, much more than rising powers like China, etc., sorry, Chinese colleagues, who have their own agenda to some extent, which is fine, or the established powers. So the middle powers, not just developing countries, but also Canada and Australia, have an interest in coming together to ensure that the G20 continues to function. So I would emphasize that as well.
Most of the panelists emphasize the nexus between financial flows and development and related issues like illicit flows and so on. But what I'd like to do now is to invite some questions and comments from the floor. But we have only 7 minutes left for this session, so I'd like to cap the number of questions at 3 and give some of the panelists to respond to the questions or comments. So yeah, we have 3 people. Okay, John?
Amar, thanks for reminding us of the good work the G20 did back in the early days on the road to Monterey, because it relates, I think, to Barry's point, which was both we don't need more money for development now, and even if we did, we couldn't get it. What I'm reminded of is just a few years ago, in the wake of the worst recession since the Great Depression, the G8 leaders at the Muskoka Summit raised $7.3 billion in new money for maternal, newborn, and child health, took it to the UN in September and got it up to an announced $40 billion. And just a couple of weeks ago, the G7 raised a few more $1 billion for the Global Alliance vaccine initiative. So I think if you have the right goals, summits, G-summits can actually get the money you need. My observation is this, though. I share Barry's skepticism about basically doubling down on what some see as a failed formula, going from 8 MDGs to 17 SDGs. But in doing that, there's a great big shrinkage for the health MDGs. At the same time, one of the great accomplishments of the Brisbane Summit was to finally do global health governance. Health was the biggest issue area where commitments were made at Brisbane. So do we see a world where the UN at summit level is going out of global health governance, but the G20 is moving in, and is that a good way to go?
Yeah, you have the next question. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. The name is Bozkır Daran. I am from Tepav. First of all, I thank you because you want to keep the focus, the attention on the subject. The question goes to the Southcenter. In 2010, there was a meeting of the UN LDC4 in Turkey, and we're going to have another meeting by the end of this year, or towards the end of the year, about how the LDCs could be integrated better into the system, and Turkey still has the presidency. And I thought that you might have mentioned that in your opening. And of course, the main drive is to have productive capacity to increase. That was the main intention of the LDCs, or low-income countries. And I think I'll cut it here. Okay, thank you.
Okay, okay, thank you. And you have the final question. Yeah. The lady in the second row.
Yes, one comment in relation to illicit financial flows and BEPS, which was addressed. I think that it was already mentioned in the first panel that this is currently being led by the OECD, but it's a global problem and it needs to be led by the UN, because otherwise developing countries, particularly for this panel, developing countries needs are not going to be considered in relation to BEPS. And in this respect, one of the basic problems that has not been addressed and will not be addressed in an OECD context and G20 context is the residence over source conflict in relation to BEPS. Yes, and that's not going to be addressed, and luckily for us, actually, it's not being addressed by the G20 and the OECD, because otherwise it's going to be even worse for developing countries' concerns. So, and in that respect, actually, BEPS affect illicit financial flows and capital flight as well. And that makes it a need for the developing countries too, since we are not able to collect taxes efficiently from corporate income tax, we need to impose other sort of taxes, yes, to imports or to exports, yes. And when we do that, we are banned at different spheres, yes, like what was mentioned before, actually, the success, or the alleged success of the World Trade Organization in relation to dispute resolution. Actually, that's not a success normally for developing countries in that sphere, because we are banned because of imposing some barriers to trade and tariffs. So that's what I...
Okay. Yeah. There were some questions, additional questions, but I'd like to, cut it off at this point and ask some of the panelists to respond to questions. Barry, you had some questions. Rahel, you, okay. Okay, anybody else would like to? Yeah.
I just answer the question. There was a philosophical question asked about the health SDGs. My own sense is that there is greater ambition than just dealing with infant mortality and maternal mortality, but I think a lot of the discussions will still take place. I am in the camp of those which say that ambition is good, but focus on results is better. In terms of the money question, I think, while I tried to link the discussion of development in New York with the discussion of development here quite intentionally, I think it's good to identify what are the priorities and then to look at what the issues of money are. So my personal view is that there are three overwhelming priorities if you're going to achieve development. One is putting domestic resources on a sound footing and to create the fiscal space that you need for development. And I think everybody is on board with that agenda right now, and I think we should therefore use it to try and get progress. If you look at Monterey, where we made progress is domestic resource mobilization. I mean, today, the share of domestic savings as a share of GDP is higher in every developing country than the OECD countries. And that would have been unthinkable. So I think we need to build on that. The second is infrastructure. So, Barry is partly right that there are no new ideas, but there are a lot of good ideas. And in a way, this is not all about concessional finance. It's about private finance, it's about MDB finance, it's better use of risk measures, etc. And I think that should be a central issue of focus that we should make in delivering results again, not just financing. But financing is part of the picture. And the final part, on which I would keep the moral conscience out there, is the commitment to the least developed countries. That's not a large sum of money, but it is a commitment. And it is in the Istanbul Program of Action. And I think, yes, accountability is a two-way street. It's absolutely clear that we have to have good governance and good results at the country level, but those who made commitments are also accountable. So I will try to keep that connection. And what I feel is that, Turkey can lead on that agenda, because Turkey is, after all, the country that owns the Istanbul Program of Action in the G20 more than any others. So I would just identify, personally, I think priorities are important, but I think those are three things that the G20 could deliver on this year.
Well, in the case of Turkey, sir, I didn't get your name, but we were actually in very deep conversation with Ambassador Apakan, who actually has retired from the Foreign Service of Turkey, about helping on the LDC monitoring and that sort of thing. I mean, if you look at the Brussels Program of Action, right, even that was not fulfilled, right? It was 25% rate of investment, 7% growth per year, right? And these are the kinds of things that we were going to look at in terms of how this can be done, in terms of, for example, what kind of reforms that would be needed in terms of access in the international economy, but also in terms of capacity building on the part of LDCs. I mean, I don't know if you remember, I didn't ask for more money in my talk, right? What I asked for in the agenda for development is that developing countries would stop investing in the financial markets of the developed countries. We didn't ask for more money, right? And we asked for a orderly liquidity regime, right? Especially for private sector emergencies, right? That we think is going to come up soon. Maybe quantitative interest rates will start to go up the middle of next year. By the end of this year, 2015, etc., there will be going to be problems, and we do not think that there will be it will be not sovereign insolvency, but private insolvencies that then fall on the lap of developing countries, right? On Barry's question, there are two goals in the SDGs that don't require money, right? It's 17.4, which I think is about debt resolution, right? I don't know whether G20 will take it up. And 10.5, right? Which is about completing the financial regulation agenda of the G20. So if you're looking for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, there are some in the SDGs that you can pick and which can then be said, well, you can justify, well, the UN decided on this, and you can do this. On the tax, I happened to be in my previous life the secretary of the tax committee, right? So one of the problems with the OECD-led process, first of all, as you said, is that it does not solve the source versus residence basis of taxation. But secondly, their method for transfer pricing management is very complicated, right? They use this arm's length principle. The Brazilians have a much simpler system, right? Where they have a set of prices. This is a Brazilian system for controlling transfer. They have a set of prices. They compare it against the prices, and if your price goes beyond that on an audit, then you will not allow you to use those prices. We developing countries have a very difficult time with OECD because they like all of these complicated ways of handling illicit tax flight and through transfer pricing, right? So if I mean, I know it's going to be a very difficult choice on the part of the dominant G20 countries. If you're willing to upgrade the tax commission and make it a truly intergovernmental body, that's something that was there in Doha. Doha was the second development for financing conference. It was almost there, but then it was assigned to the ECOSOC, and the ECOSOC in the end killed the agenda of upgrading it to an international intergovernmental body.
Just very quickly, you've made some of the points I wanted to make, but just add to what he just said regarding illicit financial flows. Individual countries, including and most, I think, developing countries, have a huge role to play because they have to put in place the rules and regulations that are needed to start curbing illicit financial flows. That includes closing loopholes. As you just mentioned, they're very, very complicated. All these, the shell companies and all these subsidiaries and the trade intentional mispricing, all of these issues are very complicated. And of course, the first thing is to raise awareness that this problem exists, and it's huge, and it's increasing rapidly. Worldwide, adjusted for inflation, illicit financial flows is growing at 10% per year. And so we're talking about a huge amount of money. And it's not just OECD or the G20 or the UN or these large international institutions. It's poor countries, developing countries also have to be involved. They have to understand what the problem, the extent of the problem, and the nature of the problem, and then make sure, learn from those that are like the Brazil and other countries who are more experienced in dealing with these issues, and make sure that all the rules and regulations are put in place. But then also, the exchange of information regarding taxation and beneficial ownerships. Who owns these companies? That's a huge mystery. There are many companies out there, and we don't know who owns them. It's too complicated. It's just it's just the way they're set up. So all of these, to have some kind of a central registry where this information becomes available is critical. So the whole world, this is a global issue, and everybody has a role to play, and it's a pressing challenge that that needs to be addressed immediately.
Okay, back in 2010, Korean presidency tried to make progress on development and global financial safety net as a key issue for developing countries, and maybe in 2015, the Turkish presidency, as a lot of panelists mentioned, could try to make progress on development and financial flows nexus, and as well as infrastructure and other issues. So with that, we'd like to wrap up this session. Thank you very much for your attention.